Thank you very much, Antonio. Thank you for the Celiac Italian committee for the kind invitation. It's lovely to be in Rome, and I apologize that I cannot give the talk in Italian. I know a few words, but not sufficient. So I thought it would be sensible to try and define a few things. So we tend to use the term gluten-related disorders to describe a group of autoimmune diseases triggered by eating gluten, which of course you all know about celiac disease. You heard this morning about dermatitis herpetiformis, but I'll concentrate in the gluten sensitivity-related neurological disorders. So I tend to use the term gluten sensitivity when I apply to the neurology cohort. It refers to all patients who have some serological positivity that implies gluten sensitivity and present or develop neurological complications. This started a long time ago. It's almost 30 years now, when we looked from a neurological perspective and started screening patients with using at the time what was available, which was Claudin antibodies in a cohort of patients with neurological presentations. And to our surprise, the frequency of these antibodies in this cohort was extremely high when compared to the healthy blood donors. And when we did the biopsies, we showed that the prevalence of celiac disease was indeed very high, 16% versus 1% in the healthy population. And that's really what started this work in the neurology of gluten sensitivity. There's an important point to make about that original study, which is the majority of patients who had neurological problems and positive Claudin antibodies actually didn't have enteropathy, yet they all improved from the neurological perspective on the gluten-free diet. Thus introducing this concept of gluten-related neurological dysfunction without an enteropathy. I want to just highlight the kind of problems that you might encounter if you are looking for these neurology cases. So obviously you are familiar with tissue transglutaminase and endomysium antibody, which are the major tests that are available in most centers. But only about a third of patients with neurological problems and gluten sensitivity will actually be positive for those antibodies. In other words, only about a third will actually have celiac disease. So if you don't use native Claudin antibodies, and I'll tell you a little bit about TG6, then you're not going to be able to diagnose the majority of those who present with a neurological problem. So after that original work, we set up a gluten neurology clinic, which takes place on a weekly basis in Sheffield. And here I'm just letting you know where we are with the majority of, in terms of the various different numbers. So by far the commonest problem we see is ataxia, meaning lack of coordination, clumsiness. Second commonest is peripheral neuropathy, and the third is what we call encephalopathy. And I'll cover those three areas in a bit more detail. What it tells you in terms, next to the number, is that you will see that the presence of enteropathy varies depending on the neurological presentation, which in itself is quite interesting. So let's start with gluten ataxia. I'm going to give you show you a video clip of a patient with late diagnosis of gluten ataxia. Before that, just to show you that the gluten ataxia accounts for the largest proportion of patients with any form of ataxia. So here's the patient with the ataxia. Okay. And next, maybe we have a bit more volume, if possible, please.
No, go back and forth. Good, yeah. Okay, that's fantastic. Back and forth. Like that. Yeah, and on the other side.
And at the same time, I'm going to read your pressure. If it is high,
So Nelly needs help by 2 people to be able to mobilize due to the severity of the ataxia. So going back to the issue of the pitfalls in the diagnosis of gluten ataxia, here's an extract from a letter from a neurology colleague who refers a patient to me with established ataxia. And you will see there that he mentions that they've already done transglutaminase antibodies to rule out celiac disease. I think most of the neurologists, at least in the UK, will think of celiac disease when they are faced with a patient with ataxia. The difficulty is that if you then do the antibody profile, you see that indeed the transglutaminase 2 and endomysium antibodies are negative at the top and bottom of that result, but the patient has very high levels of gliadin antibodies, and this patient will do very well on a gluten-free diet, even if they don't have celiac disease. The second common pitfall is when you get referred a patient with an established celiac disease. Admittedly, the GP mentions that the patient hasn't been brilliant in adhering to the gluten-free diet, but they are now much better with it, and they are sticking to the diet, but they are developing ataxia. And again, if you apply the same serological testing, you see that the patient is negative for endomysium and transglutaminase antibodies, but the gliadin antibodies are still positive. And that's sufficient to continue and perpetuate the neurological problem unless you then get the dietitian to review the patient, and you can see that with that review, you then can eliminate the gliadin antibodies completely. And that's what you really need to do to allow the patient to stabilize or recover. So in terms of the treatment, we have shown already that if you go on a strict gluten-free diet, then the ataxia improves. The sooner you make a diagnosis, the better the impact you're going to have. And this is, again, irrespective of whether or not you have celiac disease. Why is it so important to make an early diagnosis? Because if you don't, and you end up with what we call cerebellar atrophy, you see that on the left-hand side, the organ at the back of the brain is, it looks normal at that stage, but subsequently there's quite significant atrophy. Then here we are, that's the cerebellum, and this is only about 1.5 years later before the diagnosis of celiac has been made. That's not going to grow back. That's a irreversible process, and therefore the patient will remain disabled. So another way of looking at it is you have what we call a cerebellar reserve, you have a threshold. If you are above that threshold, then you can recover. If you go below that threshold and you have atrophy, whatever you do, the patient is going to remain disabled. So how do we monitor, which is very important, these patients? We use a technique called MR spectroscopy, which is just like an MRI. It takes a few minutes longer, and it measures this spectroscopy called N-acetyl aspartate, which usually reflects how well the tissue is functioning. So the higher it is, the better. And creatine is a normal metabolite, so it doesn't change in health and disease. So you tend to take the ratio of NAA to creatine, and gives you a numerical value that normally you would expect it to be well above 1, as you can see in this diagram. So if you then apply it to a patient, say, with gluten ataxia, you see that this NAA is low by comparison to creatine, so it's abnormal. But after 1 year on the gluten-free diet, you see that this is picking up, and therefore you can demonstrate the improvement in the functionality of the balance center. And that mirrors the clinical improvement, but it's also very important in telling you that you are going the right way. If you apply this to hundreds of patients with gluten ataxia, which is what we've done, you can show that those patients who go on the diet and are very strict, the NA to creatine improves. Those who, for whatever reason, don't go on the diet, it gets worse. And those who are on the diet but not very strict with it, there is a decline, but not as steep as if they're not on the diet. Now, I've separated these to those with enteropathy, but if you look at those who don't have enteropathy, it's identical. So you cannot tell if somebody has enteropathy. They will respond in a similar way to those who don't have enteropathy. Additional treatments, if despite a very strict gluten-free diet with elimination of the antibodies, there is evidence of progression, and fortunately that's only a small number of patients, then what I would recommend doing is review the diagnosis. Have you got it right, or has the patient got another cause for their ataxia, like a genetic cause? And if you are confident that they have gluten ataxia, then you can use mycophenolate and rituximab. There's some studies from European countries in the use of intravenous immunoglobulins with success, but we don't tend to use that. One other thing to mention is that there is a cohort of patients that follow a very, very dramatic and progressive, rapidly progressive ataxia, and these are the group that you need to pick up early, because if you don't intervene and make a diagnosis...
Okay, and then do the same with this leg.
They'll end up very disabled very quickly. So this is one such patient.
Okay. British Constitution. Cut. Okay. Touch your nose, touch my finger, touch your nose. And now close your eyes and touch your nose. Open your eyes, touch my finger, touch your nose, back to my finger, close your eyes and touch your nose. That's grand. Okay, now left and right, that's it.
In these patients, you are not relying entirely just on the diet if they are progressing so quickly, so you will end up giving them immunosuppression at the same time, because time is of the essence and you don't want to end up very, very disabled.
And close your eyes. Okay. Let's take a few steps this way. And let's turn around.
And this is the same patient about a year later.
A little bit about you. Tell us about you, Mitali.
Hello, my name's Mitali Cowboy. I live in Stafford. I'm 20 years old. And how much wood could a woodchuck chop if a woodchuck could have chopped wood? What do you think about how I walk?
All right, you don't need to do a catwalk.
So you see that if you intervene early and make a diagnosis early, that patient was positive for TG6 and Gladin antibodies and went on to the diet as well as having immunosuppression and did very well because he's young, I think. There's one other entity within the gluten ataxia spectrum called myoclonic ataxia, which is useful to be aware of, because if you see that combination of things is strongly associated with refractory celiac disease. And unfortunately, the prognosis is not very good. I'm going to show you a compilation of a few patients with this condition. Fortunately, it's rare. Only one of these patients is still alive. Oops, sorry. So that twitching you can see is what we call cortical myoclonus, and it can affect any part of the body. So you see this twitching there. The patient also has ataxia. Then we have another patient now with the left arm twitching.
Difficult.
They often have what we call stimulus-sensitive myoclonus.
Sorry, it's okay, just do your best.
It's very, very disabling.
For you.
So these patients need aggressive treatment with immunosuppression. Sometimes we use cladribine, which is what you use for refractory celiac. This is a patient trying to get off the floor of his house. Sometimes it can arrest the speech. Okay, so moving on to the second commonest, which is gluten neuropathy. Here we're talking about damage to the peripheral nerves. By far the commonest is the symmetrical sensory motor axonal neuropathy, but sensory ganglionopathy, which is a purely sensory form of neuropathy, is also common. And finally, what we call a small fiber neuropathy, which is damage to the tiny nerve endings. The mean age at symptom onset is 56, so it's a bit older than what you see with gluten ataxia, and the diagnosis is about 60 years, so again, much older. But it's not as disabling as the ataxia. 78% could walk independently at the last follow-up. If you look at it from the prevalence in terms of any neuropathy, and of course neuropathy is common, if you add diabetes and so forth into that, then it accounts for about 26 of all neuropathies, so it's very common. And people have done studies where they look at the prevalence of neuropathy in patients with established celiac disease and show that it's also very prevalent. In fact, the epidemiological work from Sweden showed that celiac disease was associated with a 2.5-fold increase in the risk of neuropathy. We did a study a few years back showing again that if you go on the diet, you can show improvement of the neuropathy using neurophysiology. And the other thing to highlight is that pain is prevalent in gluten neuropathy. 55% of patients will complain of pain, which, as you might expect, can be associated with poor mental health status. And again, gluten-free diet with elimination of the antibodies was associated with significant reduction of the odds for neuropathic pain. So it's well worth them adhering to a gluten-free diet. So next is this concept of the gluten encephalopathy, which is a term that we introduced to describe these patients who often complain of episodic, very severe, and sometimes intractable headaches, which are often like migraine. The scans might show abnormalities. Classically, the headache improves when they go on the gluten-free diet, and they often have cognitive problems, slow mentation, foggy brain. If you test them, you can show that they have a slow speed of processing. And of course, as you can imagine, these kind of problems will significantly interfere with their work. And the scans can look very dramatic, like a few examples here. These all white matter changes are very, very abnormal, and you can see them at variable degrees. They're not always present, but often they are. And the question is, could this kind of process, if these patients remain undiagnosed, contribute to what we call vascular dementia? And again, the epidemiological study from Sweden showed that although there was no increased risk of dementia in general in patients with celiac disease, a subgroup analysis showed that there are a higher increased risk of vascular dementia. So I think that reflects that group of patients that we are referring to. We did a study using the British Biobank data, which are very, very extensive, and we were also able to show that these patients do have cognitive deficits and do have abnormal scans. These are patients from the biobank who had celiac disease. So it's a real risk. And in terms of the prevalence of headaches, again, from the Swedish study, they showed that there was a significant association between celiac disease and headache, and that was also associated with patients who just had the serology but not had celiac disease. So when you are next seeing a patient with celiac disease, ask them about headache history, and you'll be surprised how common it is. And indeed, this is what we did with this study funded by Celiac UK. It was a 3-year prospective study where 100 patients with newly diagnosed celiac disease by my friend and colleague, Professor Sanders, were then reviewed from the neurological perspective just to see if they did have any abnormalities at the time of diagnosis. And of course, if you ask patients about this kind of problems, they offer them because you are a neurologist as opposed to a gastroenterologist. So you see that the prevalence of headache was very high. The prevalence of balance issues was about a quarter, and 12% had sensory symptoms that they never disclosed to their gastroenterologist. And in fact, on examination, there was a substantial number that had abnormal neurological exam. And if you put the signs and symptoms together, you see that 67% had such problems. Perhaps even more worrying than that was the imaging results, which showed that 46% had abnormal MR spectroscopy of the cerebellum, and that the presence of these white matter abnormalities was 19% when compared to just 3% in the healthy controls. So a real problem. We then did a follow-up study, which was a little bit hampered by the pandemic, but managed to get a substantial number of patients coming back. We showed that the prevalence of headache had dropped from the 47% to 20%. Those who had coordination problems got better, but there were some patients who reported a new onset of coordination difficulties. But interestingly, all of those patients had positive serology. And that's why it's so important on the images side, because they had a repeat imaging, we were able to show that there was a greater rate of cerebellar gray matter atrophy in the antibody positive versus antibody negative group. And you can conclude that the patients with classic celiac disease who do not adhere to a strict gluten-free diet and are serologically positive are at risk of developing ataxia. And I think that's a very powerful message as to why patients need follow-up and a close serological retesting. So why do we have these rather diverse manifestations? Well, I think the answer probably lies within the transglutaminase story. You're familiar with TG2 being the autoantigen in celiac disease, and then TG3 being the autoantigen in dermatitis herpetiformis, which is TG3 being a skin and epidermal transglutaminase. And in 2002, a colleague who works in Cardiff, Daniel Eschliman, presented for the first time data on TG6, showing that is a new transglutaminase which is primarily brain expressed. And we thought, well, that makes sense, that maybe this is the cohort of patients who are more prone to neurological problems. So we got together and were able to show that sera from our patients with gluten ataxia were recognizing TG6 antigen. And therefore, we were also able to show that those patients who have celiac disease, who are TG6 positive, are more likely to develop the neurological problem than those who are TG6 negative. And we now use the TG6 assay as part of our clinical assessment. The immunology lab has adopted it in the last couple of years. And you see that 40% of our newly diagnosed patients with the classic celiac disease are positive for TG6. Of interest is that there is geographical variation. Same group of patients from Finland only had 14% positivity. But interestingly, the group with dermatitis herpetiformis from Finland had a much higher prevalence of TG6. We had a pediatric cohort from Trieste, and we showed that they also had about a quarter had TG6, and that the TG6 correlated with the age at which the children went to the gluten-free diet. So the older you were with the diagnosis, the more likely you were to have TG6. If you look at patients with gluten ataxia based on the original diagnosis of positive claudin antibodies, then 96 have TG6, as you would expect, so a very good correlation. But there are many patients with idiopathic ataxia that are only positive for TG6, And this is data that hasn't been published yet, but is showing you that these patients with ataxia and only TG6 positivity also improve on the gluten-free diet. And because we had patients who had scans before we made a diagnosis of TG6 positivity and after, you can see how the deterioration is followed by improvement after the introduction of the gluten-free diet. So think of the neurology. I know that iceberg is mentioned in all the fields of celiac disease, but I think what you have here above the surface is a classic celiac disease with additional neurological symptoms, which is fine because these patients hopefully you'll diagnose and treat and they will be protected. Below the surface is the celiac disease presenting only with neurological symptoms. And therefore, the neurologists need to think about testing those patients. But even deeper in the ocean lies this group of patients who are just gluten sensitive without celiac disease, who present with neurological symptoms. And at the moment, this group of patients are not being diagnosed, at least perhaps diagnosed only in Sheffield. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.